Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so today let's start with something very different about Christianity. Unlike every other religion, the Bible says, test everything, hold fast to that which is good. So we're supposed to test every single thing, right? And remember what 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be prepared to give an apologia to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. And that word apologia means defense or explanation. Hang on a second. I'm getting a call here. Let me mute. Oh, you want to start recording again? That word apologia means defend or explanation. And it says always be prepared. So it's not sometimes, it's not a few people, it's always, right? So this always word here is very important for us to remember that. So God wants us all to be ready to defend our faith, to tell people what we believe and why we believe. Okay, so that word apologia means the defense of the faith, and this is what we've been talking about here today. So the things that we've talked about in this class so far is one, and Christianity isn't a blind faith. It's built on a solid historical and logical foundation. So the things that we've been talking about here is we should first prove that blind faith should never be blind. Let me erase this line here because it's kind of bug us. We prove that faith should never be blind, and that's what we did the first week. The second week, which was last week, we talked about how to prove God exists using the Bible and using science, without using the Bible and only using science. So, and that's based on the book. So then we talk about, what we're going to talk about today is proving the New Testament is accurate using archaeology and manuscript evidence. And then after that, we'll prove Jesus really existed and rose from the dead using all the above. And then we'll explain why Christ had to die and why God must punish sin. And number 6, how evil and God can coexist. So these are the 6 talks I usually give. Now, when we did the first talk, we started with an option if there is no God or there are one or more gods. That was the talk, that was a condition before Agent X. Once we've done Agent X, we proved with who is Agent X, right? We proved that the no God option does not work. Really, the only option you have is there are one or more gods, right? So this then becomes the question, is there one or more gods? Yes. Are there more than one God? Well, the answer is you can't really have one God, or because, I mean, you can't have many gods because you can only have one all-powerful being, right? So if you have one all-powerful being, the many gods option goes away and you only have one God. So now you're down to one God. Now, if you have one God, you still have a question here because is it the God of the Bible? Maybe it's not the God of the Bible. You have really 4 options. It could be the God of Islam. It could be the God of Judaism. It could be the Christianity, or it could be an unknown God. It's a God that we haven't discovered, right? We can't just say, oh yeah, it's Christianity. We have to look at the other options. Well, today we're going to talk about the Christianity and Judaism because these two share the same God. Christianity and Judaism share the same God. So we're going to talk about that. And then if we can prove that the God that of Christianity and Judaism is true, then we know that it's not an unknown God, and we know it's not Islam. And we'll do that by proving A, the Bible is accurate, and B, that Jesus really rose from the dead, proving that he is God, and therefore we eliminate the other ones, okay? So today's topic is, can I trust the Bible, and where did it come from? And we're going to focus on Christianity. Okay. Now, I was talking to a friend one day, and he said, I can't believe the Bible. In fact, I just talked to an atheist recently, and he said, well, I can't believe the Bible because it's been translated so many times. It's a translation of translation of translation. How do we know what was in the original manuscripts, the original document that the original authors wrote? We have no idea, right? And part of it is he thinks that the Bible was transmitted by word of mouth, like the Quran. The Quran was transmitted by word of mouth for a couple 100 years before it was written down. So, and then he thinks, well, the Bible's full of, he said, well, you know, the Bible's full of inaccuracies and contradictions like the Quran. So here's the question. Is the Bible full of accuracies and contradictions? Has it been translated so many times? We don't know what it actually says. Is it just a book of fables or legends that have been changed over time by people who want to manipulate and control us? Was it written years and years and years after the event? Somebody said, well, it was written like 300 years after Jesus existed. So how do we know what he really said? Another friend said, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. He never claimed to be God. So that was added by Constantine in 300 AD. So I said, what? He said, oh, no, yeah, because he said the original Bible, Jesus never claimed to be God. And that was added later. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. But here's the problem. A lot of people have no idea about the Bible. I mean, where did he learn this from? He learned this from somebody who said it, and they didn't know anything, so they just kind of muttered it. It was just a suspicion. Here's the problem. Many Christians have the same confused concepts of the Bible, and that's sad. So what I want to do is I want to show you where the Bible came from, and we're going to cover these things. One, the manuscripts of the New Testament. When were they written? How many are there? 2, the accuracy of the New Testament. 3, how the translations that we have are made. 4, how do we know the New Testament authors really believe what they wrote and weren't making it all up? And number 5, a names test for location and date. How do we know that the New Testament was written actually when it claims to have been written? Okay, so let's start with number 1, the manuscripts of the New Testament. Well, first of all, the Bible is early testimony. Let me explain what I mean by that. So here's a cross, 33 AD, right? The cross is over there, and we can tell that the New Testament was written, most of the New Testament, except for maybe the Gospel of John, was written before 70 AD. We go, well, how do we know that? Well, let me ask you this. Let's say you were writing a biography of Rudy Giuliani. For those of you who are young, Rudy Giuliani was the mayor of New York when the World Trade Centers fell, right? So you're writing a story about Rudy Giuliani, and you never mentioned the World Trade Center. And the reason he became really famous is because he was right there during 9/11 when he took control of the city and managed everything. And he did a great job of managing that horrible catastrophe. But let's say I was writing a biography of him and I never mentioned 9/11. When was that biography written? Well, everybody would realize that the biography was written before 9/11. It was before 2001. Why? Because if you're going to write a story about Rudy Giuliani, you're going to include one of the most important events, the important event that's probably centered around most of his fame. Okay, so if I'm writing a story about early Christianity and Jerusalem, there is one fact that I would put in there if I was writing after this happened. You know what that fact is? Well, it's the temple, the destruction of the temple. You see, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. Not only was the temple destroyed, but all of Jerusalem was destroyed. Now, if you're writing a book about this Christian religion, about Jesus walking around in Jerusalem, and you never mention the destruction of the temple, you know that this was written before the destruction of the temple. So we know that the Bible that we have today was written before the temple destruction. Well, here's a few other things that we know. Oh, and by the way, the Bible never mentions another important thing, the persecution of the Jews, right? The persecution of the Jews, it only mentions the persecution of the Jews by the Sanhedrin. It doesn't go into Nero, who persecuted Jews. It doesn't go into any of those other Caesars who persecuted the Christians. It doesn't go into any of that, which means that all this happened before Nero, before any of that persecution happened. Okay, so the historian Eusebius tells us that Paul died around 67 AD. So here's a historian that says Paul died in 67 AD. We know the book of James was written before 62 AD. How do we know that? Because Josephus, who was not a Christian, was a secular historian. He writes that James, the brother of Jesus, was killed by the Sanhedrin in 62 AD. So here is Josephus telling us that Jesus had a brother and he was killed by the Sanhedrin before 62 AD. So we know that the book of James was written before 62 AD. Well, we know that the book of Acts is written before 62 AD and 67 AD. Why? Because the book of Acts talks about Paul and James, who was the leader of the church at the time, as being alive and never mentions their death. So here's the leader of the church that Acts is talking about, and their primary focus in Acts is about Paul's journey, and yet it never mentions their death. So we know that it was written before James and Paul. So we know it was before 62 AD. And it doesn't also mention the persecution of Nero in those years. Okay, so we can place First Corinthians in mid-50s because Acts talks about Paul's journey, and using that journey and that map, we can date when First Corinthians is written. Paul also in First Corinthians mentions a creed that was given to him 3 years upon his, when he was on his road to Damascus. He was given a creed by the early apostles, by the 3 apostles. And so we know the creed dates as 36 AD. Okay. We know that the Gospel of Luke was written before the book of Acts. Why? Well, it's actually quite easy because Acts was written by Luke. And in Acts, Luke says, this is my second book, because the Gospel of Luke was his first book. So we know that. We know the Gospel of Mark was written before Luke. Why? Because if you look at the Gospel of Mark, you know that Luke takes a lot of Mark's framework and he builds the narrative around Mark's framework. So we know that Luke came after Mark, so Mark came before that, right? And we know that almost all of Paul's writings, 2 Corinthians, Romans, Galatians, all were written before 67 AD. Why? Because Paul was dead in 67 AD, and so there he wasn't around to write them. You go, well, how do you know Paul wrote them and not somebody else? Because Paul has this very characteristic writing style, right? And you look at any of his writings and go, yep, that was Paul. Paul wrote that, which is why we don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews, because it doesn't have Paul's characteristic style. So one theory is that Hebrews was written in Hebrew, not in, because it was written to the Hebrews by Paul, but in Hebrew and then translated to Greek. That's why it doesn't sound like Paul. But there are many other theories too about who actually wrote Hebrews. Okay, so almost all the New Testament was written before 70 AD. We know that, except for the Gospel of John, which may have been written in about 80 to 90 AD, or even 100 AD. Okay, we call this the age of the eyewitnesses. Now, why do we call it the age of the eyewitnesses? Is because anybody who was alive when Jesus was crucified would most probably still be alive 40 years later, right? So even take somebody who was 50 years old. 90 was a very common age for many Jews because they had a very healthy lifestyle, ate healthily. So those people would still be alive. So that's why we call it the age of the eyewitnesses. Okay. Now, remember Julius Caesar, right? Julius Caesar wrote a book. It was called the Gallic Wars. Julius Caesar wrote the book around 47 BC. We never found the book, but we found a copy that was made in the 9th century. So here's the book. He talks about his Gallic Wars, about how he invaded Gaul and all that. So we never found the original that he wrote, but because he was important, people copied it, and people made copies of copies of copies. But we didn't find a copy until 900 AD when we found one copy, and that was made 940 years after the original. So again, we don't have the original. That was lost. All the copies of the copies of the copies, all those were lost. But we found a copy of a copy of a copy that was made in 900 AD. We don't know how many copies later it was, but depending on how important it was. And since then, we found about 251 copies. Okay, so, and you can see these in libraries and in collections. So that's the same for Plato. Plato wrote in 330 BC. We never found the original, but we did find a copy of a copy of a copy that was made in 895 AD. The time span is 1200 years. And since then, we found 238 copies. Now, these will change. It'll increase every so often when we find a new copy somewhere that dates to an older age. But this is about right. Herodotus, 440 BC is when he wrote it. The copy that we found was dated to the 1st century. 500 years between the original and the copy, 160 copies, and so on and so forth. So then we come to the New Testament, right? The New Testament was written, as I said, between 60 to 90 AD, right? Most of it before 70 AD, and maybe the book of the Gospel of John after 90 AD. Well, so the question is, what is the earliest copy of the earliest manuscript of the Bible that we found? Now, we never found the original, right? Let's take the book of John, right? The Gospel of John. We never found the original document written by John or written by one of his scribes in their own handwriting. But we did find a copy that was found a few years later. Now, notice this. Caesar, it was 940 years after the original was named that we found a copy. This is the best one. Thucydides, 200 years after the original was made that we found the original copy, and we had 188 copies of that. So when did we find the Ollie's copy that we found? When was it made? Well, anybody want to guess? Guess a number. Pick a number. Do you think it was 100 years later, 200 years later, 300 years later, 1,000 years later? When did we find the earliest copy of a copy of the Bible? Well, here's the answer.
100.
It was 115 AD.
Oh, I'm close.
That is about 25 years afterwards.
Wow.
So
Whoa.
we never found the original, but we found a copy of the copy 25 years after. And then how many copies and fragments did we find? Want to take a guess?
50?
31,000.
Oh my God.
5,366 alone in Greek, the rest in other languages and translations. So I want you to compare this time span to this time span, the copies and fragments, this number to this number, right? Now, let me explain what was going on here, right? And by the way, you can find all these copies and fragments all over the world, but today on the internet, you can find them on the internet anytime. Just go back and show me some of the earliest fragments of the Bible that you have. And then you'll be able to find it. Whoops.
New York has a Bible museum.
Yeah, and there's a lot of them in the Bible Museum. Now, I don't think you can, I think you have to see them through the glass. You can't touch them, but you can totally see them. Okay, so let me explain what we're talking about here. So here's 90 AD. John the Apostle sits down to write something, right? He's a very important person. So a lot of his apostles, remember, and as you'll see later, the apostles had apostles. So the apostles, his disciples would copy it, and then they would send it to other churches. Those churches would copy it. And here was a copy that was made in 115 AD, 25 years later. And then those copies would get sent out, and they get copied all over the place. But then somehow along the line, we lost most of these earlier copies, right? So instead, all we were left with was 115 AD. Maybe the Romans came and destroyed them, or they just got naturally lost, whatever, right? And this is the copy that we have today, right? That you can find. And then you can see a whole bunch of copies after that too. Okay, so now let's look at the accuracy of the New Testament. So here's the question. Are all of these 31,000 or slash 5,366 documents identical? Right now, the 5,366 documents are Greek documents, and some of them are of one gospel, some of them are other gospels, but you can see the mass quantity of that we have, right? So are they all identical? Well, the reality is they were all done on scrolls, right? And then initially they were all done on scrolls, but when they were doing on scrolls, they would make mistakes, right? Let me past that. So they would make mistakes. For instance, when comparing one manuscript to another, they would make a typo, right? Because they're looking at the one scroll and they're copying on the next scroll, and it's natural that they're going to make errors. And so there are errors, misspelled words, missing sections or lines, missing a duplicated digits and numbers, duplicated words, you know? So you see lots and lots of these errors. Let me give an example of, as I used a chicken curry recipe example. My mother made the best chicken curry ever made in the world, right? But let's say that you got her recipe and it said use 3 pounds of chicken. And somebody had made a typo and they said chicken, C-H-I-K instead of C-H-I-C. Or instead of saying use 3 pounds of chicken, it said use off 3 pounds of chicken. Now, these are typos, and you can look at this and you can go, oh, I know what they mean, right? So these are typos. They're easy to anticipate. They're easy to fix, and they don't change the meaning, right? It's easy for you to figure this out. Well, so now my question is, if we take all these, all the red ones were lost, all the red circles are lost, red outline ones are lost. But if we take all the ones that weren't lost, and we compare them to each other, and we remove these easy to fix typos, right? How different is this copy that we found in Rylands from this copy that we found in, say, Egypt, and this copy that we found in Rome from this copy that we found, say, in Spain? Again, just looking at the Greek ones, right? How different are they from each other? Do you think it's a 10% difference, 50% difference, 100% difference? Because you think about it, there are 5,000 copies, right? So if each copy had one error, that's 5,000 errors. One unique error, that's 5,000 errors. So when you fix all those errors, how different is the one to the other? Well, the answer is, once spelling errors and copies errors account for, there is less than 1% difference. So now let me ask this. If this that we found in Rylands matched this we found in Ethiopia, what do we know about the original? This copy that matches within 1%, how matched is it to the original manuscript? Well, it's going to be 1%, right? This also proves that nobody could have rewritten the Bible to make it say something they wanted to say. Because if they had, where are all those other fragments? They would have to go all over the world, find those other versions and destroy them all to make sure that there wasn't a single version available, right? Today we call this blockchain verification, right? What is blockchain? You know what blockchain is, right? It's when we do transactions with Bitcoin or something like that. Or if I have a document, I want to make sure it hasn't been changed, I use blockchain. What do? Is when I publish the document, I publish that manuscript or the notice to billions of servers everywhere, right? Not billions, say millions of servers everywhere. Then if one person says, hey, I disagree with it, they're like, okay, well, how many servers can you say agree with you? They're like, well, I have 20. Well, we have 100,000 that disagree with you. So then you go with the 100,000. So that's what blockchain does. And this is exactly what it says. It says, look, we got 5,366 that say this, and you have one that says something else. We know that this is not what the original is, right? So how could somebody change the Bible if they wanted to? They would have to travel all over the world. Remember, the Bible started in, let me get this. So the Bible starts here in Jerusalem, right?
Yeah.
And it moves all over Asia and all through Africa, all over here. All these blue parts are Christian churches. There's thousands and thousands. It's about 3,000 churches here, 300,000 people here. There are thousands of people all here. The Bible is spread all through the Mediterranean. If you wanted to go and find all these copies of manuscripts that people are randomly making without any central control, how would you find them all, right? Especially if you're like somebody, let's say you're a monk of this Ethiopian monastery up in the Ethiopian mountains. And then you would see the Romans coming. Let's say it was some Roman wanted to come and change all your manuscripts. You would see the Romans on their little horses coming up your mountain. Long before they got to your mountain, you'd see them and you go, oh, look, some Romans coming. I wonder what they want. The Romans come and they say, okay, give me all your documents. Give me all your old versions of the Bible. We are going to change them. Well, first of all, you've had these Bibles for hundreds of years. So the paper is all yellow and worn out. And the ink is different. The ink is different. So if you write a new version of that Bible, people go, oh, I can tell that this is a new version. The ink is different. The paper is different. It's not as old. All these problems you have. But let's say you manage that, right? And then you said, okay, Ethiopian monks, use this new Bible for now. The Ethiopian monks will say, yes, you bet. Are you going to leave anybody here? They go, no, we got other work to do. Everybody leaves. What do you think the monks are going to do? They're going to go down to their cellar, bring out the originals, the old originals, and throw out the new changes, and you'll have the original. So that's why it's impossible for anyone to have changed the Bible. Okay. Now, here's the other thing that's very interesting. There are possibility of what we call subject matter errors. Okay, so remember I told you there were typos. So those are easy to fix. And by the way, when I'm teaching this live, I play a game with the kids. And we break them up into groups, and we get we give the first set of kids a paragraph to write out, And into each piece of paper, they write out like a 20-word paragraph onto a piece of paper. Into each piece of paper, they put one error. So they take the original paragraph, they make an error, and they pass it to the next table. The next table has to put an error and pass it to the next table. And each of them make two different errors on each piece of paper. And so at the end of the group, you get the group, you end up with like lots of errors in the paperwork. And each time you pass it on, you say this is generation 1, generation 2, because we can date these. You can carbon date these Bible passages. So now, then what I would do is I would go through and I would randomly collect a bunch of these papers and throw them out. And I'd say, okay, kids, at the last table, there are 5 or 6 versions of the Bible. And you got to remember, you got to figure out what the original paragraph said. And I give them these 5, 6. I said, well, and they'll look, well, this is generation 1. This is generation 2. Because what are the chances that somebody on one other table is going to make the exact same mistake of somebody on this table? Very unlikely. So you can just go back to the older version and say, well, obviously this is where the change was made. Oh, I see this change was made here. And we can even track and we can say, oh, we see that this copy was made from this copy because they have the same error. You can actually track the errors through it. And so the last table would then get it. And every time I've done this with kids, mind you, kids, they've got the original paragraph 100%.
Wow.
Okay.
That's
because it's easy. It's easier, right?
Right.
And today with a computer, it's even easier, right?
Yeah.
But you can figure this out easily. You can figure out what the original was. But that is for what we call typos. Now, let's look at what we call subject matter differences. So let's say you get a recipe and somebody has messed with it. Instead of saying Neil's mother's chicken curry, it says Neil's uncle's chicken curry. Well, you don't want to taste my uncle's chicken curry because he can't cook, right? But instead of saying 3 pounds of chicken, it says use 3 kilograms of chicken. Well, guess what? Now you've got too much chicken because you got 2.2 times as much chicken and not enough spices. It's not going to be very, very tasty. What if it says use 3 pounds of mutton? Well, then it's not a chicken curry recipe, it's a mutton recipe. So these are important things. What if it says people who eat chicken are murderers and shall perish in the chicken coop of eternal torment? And you go, oh yeah, this is not a recipe. This is not the original recipe, right? So obviously these subject matter differences are very important.
Yeah.
Well, how many subject matter differences are there? Well, it turns out that there's less than 1% subject matter. Remember I told you the 1% difference? These are the subject, this is the 1% differences. Okay, of 20,000 lines in the New Testament, each line's about 10 words, so there's about 200,000 words. Well, only 400 words in the entire New Testament are in question. Subject matter errors, right? Which means 1% is really an exaggeration because 400 divided 200,000 equal 0.2%. That means the New Testament manuscripts are 99.8% accurate.
Wow.
I lied when I said
Never
it was
thought about
1%. It's actually 99.8% accurate. We know exactly what it is. But wait a minute, what other changes? Those subject matter errors are important, right? Well, here, let me give you an example of a subject matter error. Matthew 19:29, right? So here's one of those. If you pick up your Bible and you read this passage, you will say, and everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. Well, you see that little 1 up there, the green 1? If you have a good Bible and you look down at the bottom, it'll say some MSS, means manuscripts, some manuscripts say mother or wife. In other words, some manuscripts, the later manuscripts, because the closer you are to the source, the more accurate you are, right? So the earlier manuscripts is what we're going to put on the top, and the later manuscripts we're going to put as a footnote, right? So nobody's hiding anything from anybody. So it says father or mother. Some manuscripts, more recent manuscripts say father or mother or wife or children or fields. And now you see that doesn't really change the meaning of this passage, right? Somebody just added or wife in there, right? And it turns out that New Testament has 0 unknowns because we know 100% of the content. The only thing we don't know is does it go in the footnote or does it go above, right? We have all the content. And none of these 400 words differences cast doubt on the death and resurrection of Jesus, the divinity of Christ, the nature of God, or any of the salvation issues. Either they're covered in other areas, or like if something's missing in one passage, they're covered in another area, the resurrection with it. Okay. Now somebody might say, but Neil, I thought the New Testament was inerrant and infallible. Yes, it is. But we're talking about the original Greek that the apostles wrote themselves. Those are inerrant and infallible, not the copies or the translations, right? So in other words, if you go out and you buy a book, a translation in English from a printer, and the printer accidentally doesn't print a page, we're not saying your book that you got from the printer is infallible. No, we're saying the original document written by the apostles, which we don't have today, those are inerrant and infallible. Okay, but why wouldn't God preserve the originals? I mean, a lot of people say, well, how come we don't have the originals? Well, here's why. Let's say I had the original and it was verified and you just had copies of it. Let's say I was an evil person and I got control of this. Let's say I was a church, like the Catholic Church, right? And I wanted to change what the Bible said. What could I do? I could change the original and claim all your copies at errors, couldn't I? But if all of us just have copies, then it's almost a majority rule. No one had the power, so it's better that we don't have the originals. It's called, again, blockchain. See how important it is that nobody has the original Bible. We all have copies, so then we can say, yes, let's compare our copies, and we know that the majority rules. Because nobody would be able to go to all through the world and change all the Bibles to say what they wanted to say, right? You can see how God planned this. And also remember these, all these different translations. Well, you can go translate any of these Bibles back into Greek or English and see if they say exactly what we think they should be saying. Okay, now here's another thing that's very interesting. Now, if you go to listen to your pastor is going to preach the word, right? And he's going to quote the Bible. Well, before the Bible was put together in about 300 AD, before that was just all these copies that we knew were running around. And why we don't have time to go into how they chose the Bible versus what goes in the Bible. But what they did basically is they said, if we know where it came from and it has apostolic succession, then we know it's going to be part of the gospel. If the churches were already using it, then we'll admit it into the gospel canon. But anyway, before all that happened, these people would give sermons, right? And if you take the sermons just from the Bible preachers, right? And here's one, it's called the Didache, the teaching of the apostles. It dates to 90 to 100 AD. And of course, parts of the New Testament. Like for instance, here's just the quotes from Matthew, right? Now, it wasn't called the Gospel of Matthew, it was the teachings of Matthew, or it was the writings of Matthew, but everybody had it. All these pastors had the writings of Matthew, and they quote from it, right? Now, and what's very interesting, the Didache was in I think it was 90 AD. So in other words, we have the Didache, we have sermons from the original documents before we even have the original documents, which tells you that the original documents are actually older than the manuscripts, right? Because we have copies of the Rylands fragments in 119, but Matthew might be 300 AD, and yet we have quotes from Matthew that were written in 90 AD, right? Okay. Hang on. Hang on a second. What?
Yeah.
Oh. Sorry, guys. I have to hand something to somebody. Okay, sorry, guys.
No problem.
Okay, so if we gather all these writings, we can reconstruct over 40% of the verses of the entire New Testament. So this proves the New Testament documents existed before 90 AD. So you can see over and over again, not only do we have the manuscripts, but we have the quotes, and we can put all this together. Now, here's another one. Remember I told you that I had a friend who said that Constantine came up with the idea that Jesus was God? Well, Constantine was in like 300 AD, right? Well, let's look at this guy, Pliny the Younger, governor of Pontius, in 111 AD. So 200 years before Constantine was born. And he's writing a letter to the Emperor Trajan. And he says, he is sent out to arrest the Christians. He said, they, the Christians, asserted, however, that the sum and substance of the fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsibly a hymn to Christ as to a God. So just look at that part. Here is 111 AD. What are the Christians doing? They're singing a hymn to Christ as to a God. Constantine didn't come up with the idea of Jesus being God. It was in the Gospels already, and it was always there, right? Okay. So let's now look at the translations. How are the translations made? Okay, now most people think the translations were made like, somebody translated and then they translate and translate. You know the game of telephone, right? Somebody
Yeah.
says P's and then the next person says B's, and then it ends up with a completely different word that you started with. So they think this is how the Bible is translated, right? They go, oh, look, we had the Greek original, somebody made a Greek copy, and then we had the English translation, then we had the New English translation, and many English translations later. How do we know what was in the original? Well, let me ask you a question. Why would you translate the Bible like that? What on earth would make you think you should do that? That's not how the Bible is translated. Here's how the Bible is translated. Here's a Greek original, right? We find the earliest Greek copies and we make a translation, right, from those copies. Now let's go forward 100 years, 1,000 years, whatever, as many years as you want. The original Greek was done in 1500. So let's go forward 500 years, 600 years, and look at the newer. We want to make a new translation. Well, let me ask you this. Why would I go back to this translation? Why wouldn't I just go back to the original copies? We have the original copies. In fact, here's what's interesting. Today's translations are more accurate than the older translations. Why? Because you see, let's say this translation was done in the 1500s, 1600s. Since then, we found the Rylands fragment. We found earlier manuscripts. Well, the earlier manuscripts are always going to be more accurate than the later manuscript. Why? Because there's less chance of an error, right? So now when I do a new translation, I'm not going to go back to the old translations. I'm going to go back to the English and the older manuscripts that I have. Now, of course, they're only more accurate on those 400 words, but because we have all the content, there's not going to be more content coming out. Right? Well, how do we know that? Well, because the early church back in 300 AD, they listed all the books that were being used. So unless you think if somebody wrote a book after 300 AD, well, we don't care about it. Like the Gospel of Thomas was written in 300 AD. A lot of people talk about the Book of Enoch. The part 2 and 3 of the Book of Enoch were written after 300 AD. So we don't care about it, right? Okay. So here's how we translate our English today. Today's translation is made from the earliest manuscripts, and we use the rest as the reference. All right. Okay. And if you don't like or trust any of the translations, learn Greek. Make your own translation from the online pictures of the manuscripts. Use a Greek English linear translator. Here's the Greek English. Here's the Greek word from the original manuscripts. And then it tells you the anglicized, how to pronounce it, gives you the Strong's Concordance. It gives you all these different things, and then it translates it right there. So you can make your own translation, or you can use ChatGPT to translate it. See what it says, right? Do whatever you want, but you can translate yourself. And all those copies and fragments are available online. So if you don't trust the translators, do your own from the original manuscripts. Okay. Well, how do we know the New Testament authors really believe what they wrote and weren't making it all up? Well, first of all except John died terrible, painful deaths after suffering persecution, and John died in exile after suffering and persecution. Right? You may die for a lie that somebody else made up and fooled you about it. Right? He actually didn't die in exile, but he died after he came out of exile. You may die for a lie that somebody else made up and fooled you about. But why would you suffer and die for a lie that you made up yourself? I mean, think about it. Why on earth would make you want to die for something that you knew was a lie, right? Okay, here's the other thing and why we know the Bible is accurate. The Bible has embarrassing testimony. Let me give you an example. Let's say you are Peter and you want to write the Bible to become head of this new religion. Would you write that you denied Christ 3 times? Remember,
No.
Peter became the head after Paul and after James died. Peter became the head. Peter's not going to write, well, I denied Christ 3 times. And then would you write that when the Jews came to arrest Jesus, Would you write that you all ran away? No, you wouldn't. These
Yeah.
are embarrassing things. And guess who? The women are the brave ones. While the men were hiding and being scared, what were the women doing? The women were like, going, let's go to the tomb and see if we can put more more fragrance on Jesus' body, right? You wouldn't write it like that if you're. Well, here's the other thing. They fall asleep on Jesus twice. They make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial. And this is the funniest one. Peter is called Satan by Jesus. Can you imagine they're sitting around like, okay, we want to make up the story so that we can create this new church and become very famous. And then Mark says, okay, Peter, I'm going to put in here that Jesus calls you Satan. Peter goes, why should he call me Satan? I want to be the head of the church. Have him call John Satan, right? You don't do this stuff, right? And then Paul and Peter disagree about theological issues. Peter goes, no, I'm not going to put that in there. I want everybody to think I'm always right. The only reason you put this stuff in is if it's true, right? More on that. What about Jesus, right? If you were writing a story trying to make Jesus God, would you write that he was considered out of his mind by his own family? Would you write that he was deserted by his followers? Would you write that his own brothers didn't believe him? In fact, here's the thing. James ended up believing in Jesus. What does it take for you to believe that your brother is God? I will talk about that in the next talk. Jesus thought to be a deceiver. He turns off Jewish believers that they want to stone him. He's called a madman. He's called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed. His feet are wiped with the hair of prostitute. He's crucified, despite the fact that anyone who's hung on trees under God's curse. You would never create these things if you were writing a made-up story, right? So somebody said, well, couldn't the stories about Jesus be a myth that was invented over time? Well, here's the problem. Tests show that even 2 generations, was 48 years, is too short to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the historical hardcore of historical facts. I mean, think about it. Somebody was writing a story about Hitler. Here we are, what, 60, 80 years after Hitler? Yeah, 80 years after Hitler. Would anyone believe if we made Hitler this Viking god who had lightning come from his hand? No, nobody would believe it because it's too short a time. You need longer times to create this mythic periods of him. Well, couldn't the stories about Jesus be a myth that was invented over a period of time? Well, as I'm going to show you next, and as C.S. Lewis, who's an expert in myth, says the New Testament is not mythic in its presentation. So let's look at why it's not mythic. Here is Luke, who turns out to be one of the most accurate historians. Here's what he says. He says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod Tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip Tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias Tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Ananias and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the desert. Okay, now, like, is this a myth? No, think about it. Does it sound like he's making up a fantasy story? He intends it to be verified. An exact date is given. Now you'd say, well, wait a minute, because now we write stories like this and we try to place that date is given, 1829. All 8 people are known from history. All were known to live at this exact time. It's not a once-time story. It is not a myth. Remember, I told you that Luke was a very accurate historian. Well, it turns out that if you look at the Acts, which is written by Luke, there are 84 historically confirmed eyewitness details. John has 59 historically confirmed and historically plausible eyewitness details, things that most likely would happen in those scenarios. Luke has over 20 details, right, of these. The Gospel of Luke has 20 of these details, right? Luke is an amazing historian. Hamer says there are 84 specific facts confirmed by historical and archaeological research. Ports, boundaries, landmarks, line terminology, local language, local deities, and local industries. For instance, there were all these heads, like, you know, in Rome, the head of state was called Caesar, right? But in Cyprus, they were called proconsul. In Philippi, they were called governors. In Thessalonica, they were called rulers. In Ephesus, they were called town clerks. In Malta, they were called chief man. Luke doesn't say, oh, they were a ruler or they were a Caesar. He tells you their exact name. It's like, you know, in California, if you're on the city council, you're called a city councilman. but if you're in Connecticut or something, I think they're called aldermen, right? And if Luke could just say, oh yeah, the city councilman from Connecticut, you're like, ah, maybe he doesn't know what he's talking about. But he says, no, the alderman from Connecticut, and you're like, oh yeah, he knows about that, right? There are 31 historical people in the New Testament, people that historians thought were real human beings, right? And these are all confirmed by other historians. For the longest time, they said that Pontius Pilate was not a real person. They said, oh, the Bible just made up Pontius Pilate. He wasn't a real governor of Judea. Well, then they found a stone that said that it was written by Pontius Pilate, right? And it said his name on it. Then, of course, for the longest time, they said there was nobody called Joseph Caiaphas. And then they found his ossuary, that's his bone box, that had Joseph Caiaphas on it, right, carved on it. So, and then we're still not done. There are 10 ancient non-historian Christian sources, including Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Thalius, Phlegon, the government official Pliny, we talked about, Emperor Trajan, the Emperor Hadrian, other sources, including the Jewish Talmud, the Greek writers. All these people talk about Jesus, right? Remember, I said, I'll prove that Jesus was a real historical person. Well, we've got the following things. So if I just go back and I look at these historians and nobody else, not the Bible, just these historians, here's what I will find from these historians. One, Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. He lived a virtuous life. He was a wonder worker. He had a brother named James. He was acclaimed by them to be the Messiah. He was crucified on Pontius Pilate. An eclipse and an earthquake occurred when he died. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. His disciples were willing to die for their belief. Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome, and his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God. None of this came from the Bible. All of this comes from secular historians. And this is exactly what the New Testament says. Okay. Now somebody said, well, that was 2,000 years ago. How can we be sure what happened 2,000 years ago? Well, let me ask you this. Einstein discovered the theory of relativity, right? We all know that. If someone who knew Einstein wrote about this 25 years after it happened, would it be true when they wrote it? Sure. Okay. If you read that fact 100 years later, would it still be true? Sure. So 100 years later wouldn't make it false. It wouldn't suddenly become false, right? If you read that fact 2,000 years later, would it still be true? Yes. Okay. So why is when you read it or how old it is relevant at all? It isn't. It's not relevant when you read the passage. It's relevant when it was written. The only important thing would be how long after the event did they write the historical account, and if they could have known it firsthand, not when somebody read it. So you're reading it 2,000, you're saying, why do we know what happened 2,000 years ago? Because they wrote about it 25 years after the event, right? In 50 AD and 60 AD. Okay, could the disciples have been lying at first? Yeah, but does the evidence support this? None of them recanted. They would all have to have a mass detail hallucination. They would all have had to write the Bible such that none of them would be paying good light. It had to give up sex, money, power, sleep, safety, and family to spend their lives walking across the world, no cars, no air conditioning, running from adversaries, right? They had nothing to gain and everything to lose, including their lives. At some point, they had said, yeah, we're not making much money on this. We're not getting many women, and I have no power. It's time to go back to fishing. But they didn't. Instead, what they do, they died for their beliefs.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Well, couldn't they have twisted things in their mind after 25 to 60 years? Yes, but they weren't arguing some minor doctrine. If someone you loved and spent every waking hour with for 3 years died and you physically prepared his body and buried him, would you forget that? That person then physically came back to life and spent 40 days with you, eating and drinking, would you forget that? If you then found you could heal people and bring the dead back to life, would you forget that? No, you'd never forget any of that. It's not something minor we're talking about. Okay, maybe we'll have time to cover it. Oh, well, can we go a few minutes late?
Yeah, we'll go.
Okay, so let's talk about the names test, right? So here is the final proof that the Bible was not written 100 years later. Because you're like, well, how do we know it wasn't written hundreds of years later? Okay, so here are the most popular names in America in 1910. William is number 3. Yeah, sorry, William is number 2. Joseph is 7, Elizabeth is 6. 10 years later, William drops down number 3, Joseph moves up number 6, and Elizabeth drops down to number 7. Okay, 100 years later, Joseph stays even. Joseph is still the 6th most popular name in America. William has dropped all the way down to 10, and Elizabeth has dropped all the way down to 10. Right, so we see that names change in popularity every 10 years or so. Okay, now they also and they change randomly. You can't guess that. They also change from city to city. So a group of people did a study of the names in, for instance, the most common names in California are not going to be the same common names in New York. The most common names in America are not going to be the most common names in India, right? So a group of people said, let's study all the names we can find from the 1st century. So they looked at archaeological finds, the tombstones, they looked at ossuaries, they looked at all the historians, Josephus, Tacitus, all these guys, and they came up with a list of Jewish names, and they found that the Jewish names in Judea were different from Jewish names in Rome or Greece or Egypt or elsewhere. They're all unique. They all changed in popularity differently. Some of the names were similar, but they differed in popularity, right? Okay. So, for instance, in Egypt, around the 1st century, Eleazar was the most popular one in Egypt, but it was only 3rd popular in Judea. And Eleazar is the same as Lazarus, right? Sabbathias was the 2nd most popular, but in Judea, nobody was named Sabbathias, so it was the 68th. I mean, a few people were, but 68th. Joseph was popular in Egypt and in Judea. Dositheus was 4th popular and 16th popular in Judea. Pappus was 4th popular in Egypt, was 39th popular in Judea, and same with that and Samuel, right? So you see that the names differ just in region. And Egypt was what? Barely a couple hundred miles from Judea. Okay, so then they said, okay, let's look at the Gospel and Acts and just take the names in the Gospel and Acts. So they found out the top 2 men's names in the Gospel is Simon and Joseph. These occur 18%. The top 9 men's names occur 40%. Then they took the women's name. The top 2 women's names, Mary and Salome. Now it's a smaller sample size, so we expect bigger error here. And then the top 9 women's names was 61% of all the names in the New Testament, right? So again, smaller sample size. Well, now let's look at what the study of the historical archaeology says of the names in Judea. Well, it turns out that the top men's names was 15% in Judea, and it shows up 18%, within 3%. Top 9 men's names is within 1%. The top women's name is 10%, smaller size, and this is another 10%. So it's a small sample size. We understand you could have errors. But here's the question. How did the Gospel and Acts naming people in Judea get so much accuracy on names, a concept that would have never occurred to them? So that means they would have had to go back to, let's say they wrote it in Egypt 100 years later. They'd have to go back and figure out what the most popular names were in Judea 100 years earlier to try and match the name frequencies, something they would never do, right? So here's, like, for instance, the popular in Judea is Simeon, and there are 8 individuals in the New Testament called Simeon. Joseph or Joseph, there are 6, is the 2nd most popular, and there are 6 individuals. Lazarus or Eleazar is the 3rd popular, and there are 2 individuals. So Judas is 5th popular, and there are 5 individuals. So you can see the matching, and Jesus and Joshua was 6th popular, and there are 2 individuals. So you can see that the similarities match, except for the Lazarus one, right? So here's the question. If you were writing this and making it up 100 years later, you couldn't get the statistical probability of the names correct, especially since Jerusalem had been completely destroyed by AD 70. Not only, I mean, destroyed, meaning that every single building was taken down, all the walls were destroyed, everything was destroyed. So how would you come up with exactly the same Rice analysis? So here are the reasons why we need not doubt the Bible today. 1, copies date to within 25 years of the original. Copies spread around the world over the centuries match within 99.8% of each other. The 0.2 differences are minor and not theological issues or resurrection contradictions, and we have 100% of all possibility. 31,000 copies in other languages and 5,000 available today. We can recreate over 40% of the Bible from the quotes alone. It was translated into many languages as well, which can be used to verify the original words. The names match statistically, which would have been impossible to fake without modern archaeology. Number 8, authors include embarrassing testimony. Number 9, authors died for what they wrote. 10, it's historically verifiable. 11, the chain of custody, which is called the apostolic succession. We don't have time to cover that, but all this explains where we're going with this. And I want you to give you a comparison. In the Old Testament, in the ancient days, this is the Temple of Delphi. The priestess of Delphi was this lady who sat on over a fissure. This is the Temple of Delphi, of a fissure, and volcanic gases would come up, and this lady would sit there and breathe the gases and prophesy the future, and they would be the word from God for them, right? And they would have to travel all the way here, give them money, donate, and just to hear some words, and the words were always kind of vague and you could never understand it. And yet we have the Bible from God directly. We don't have to do all of this thing. And let me close with this video by Jordan Peterson. Let's make sure the videos work there. What did we have to do last time to make sure that we had the audio working? Do you remember? Let's see.
Share the
Let me
sound.
see if you hear it. Can you hear it?
No. Share the sound.
Let's see. I got to go back to the. Here you go. Share. No. Content, share sound. Okay, there it is. I don't know why they don't automatically do that. Okay, here.
And about the world, for that matter.
Can you hear this?
Yeah, can you
If you take
louder?
a complex
Yeah.
piece of
I
literature
don't know if I can
like a
control it.
Shakespeare.
You may have a controller on your. Let me check. I've turned it up here. Just says you're sharing sound.
We can hear it, but just louder.
Let's see. Technical issues. I think I'm just changing it on mine. I think you have. Can you try turning up?
There's no end to the number of interpretations that you can make of it.
Is that good?
You know,
Very
you
good.
can interpret each word, you can interpret
Let me
each
go
phrase.
back and start again.
There's this postmodern idea about literature and about the world, for that matter, that if you take a complex piece of literature like a Shakespeare play, there's no end to the number of interpretations that you can make of it. You know, you can interpret each word, you can interpret each phrase, each sentence, each paragraph, you can interpret the entire play. The way you interpret it depends on how many other books you've read, depends on your orientation in the world. It depends on a very, very large number of things, how cultured you are or how much culture you lack, all of those things. It opens up a huge vista for potential interpretation. And so the postmodernists sort of stubbed their toe on that and thought, well, if there's this vast number of interpretations of any particular literary work, how can you be sure that any interpretation is more valid than any other interpretation? And if you can't be sure, then how do you even know those are great works? How do you know they can't? Maybe they're just works that the people in power have used to facilitate their continual accession of power, which is really a postmodern idea and a very, very cynical one, but it has its point. But the thing is, it's grounded in something real, right? It's like, yes, you can interpret things forever. I want to show you something here, just briefly. We'll go back to it later. Look at this. This is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. So, at the bottom here, every single one of those lines is a biblical verse, okay? Now, the length of the line is proportionate to how many times that verse is referred to in some way by some other verse. So you say, well, this is the first hyperlinked book, right? I'm dead serious about that. You can't click and get the hyperlinks, obviously, but it's a thoroughly hyperlinked book, and it's because, well, the people who worked on these stories that are hypothetically at the end, right, which is the end can't affect the beginning. That's the rule of time, right? What happens now can't affect what happened to you 10 years ago, even though it actually can, but whatever. Well, you reinterpret things, right? And then they're not the same, but whatever, we won't get into that. But technically speaking, the present cannot affect the past. But if we're looking at a piece of literature, that's not right, because when you write the end, you know what was at the beginning. And when you write the beginning or edit it, you know what's at the end. And so you can weave the whole thing together. And there's 65,000 cross-references, and that's what this map shows. And so that's a great visual representation of the book. And then you can see, well, why is it deep? Why is the book deep? Well, just imagine how many pathways you could take through that, right? I mean, you just journey through that forever. You'd never, ever get to the end of it. There's permutations and combinations, and every phrase is dependent on every other phrase, and every verse is dependent on every other, not entirely, but 65,000 is not a bad start. And so,
Yeah. That's the video. So let's end with this. Christianity isn't a blind faith. It's a rational faith built on a solid historical and logical foundation. And thousands of people have suffered all over the world to protect it and to preserve it. And we have it ready for us. So you should be reading it on a daily basis and listening to it on a daily basis, because it has changed the world and it can change your life. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you so much. It's I feel I'm in the really high high intense class for proof Bible it's real. Okay, let me open the time. Everybody, you guys can if you want to have asking question, now is your time. Thanks again, Neil, to join
Yeah, you're good.
share the time with us. Anybody questions? Or what do you learn from this today session that it's encouraged you or that this is something new to you? To me, let me share one thing and well, two things about the Bible translation. I never know the translation is from, you're right, because most people were thinking we translate from the previous one, not original
Right.
one. And now the modern world actually is true that we have more strong languages, so we can go back to original one. So it's much more accurate. And that was really amazing. I never thought about that. I knew that, but it just like when you map all this up, then yeah, that's right. And another thing is the name. I never thought about, yes, the name is another evidence. So yeah, we all know that exists, but we just not linking together. So this class is really amazing. I want to say again. Okay, anyone else? Well, definitely has more, but I want to share those and then
Yeah,
give
again, it could be
everybody.
questions, could be anything, any topic that we covered or not covered even, or just questions in general about the Bible.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay,
so next week we're not meeting, right?
yeah. Okay. I guess people are too shy. So, so just announce that next week I have a conference meeting. So we will postpone to March 25th, still the Wednesday night. And then that means the class originally it's ending at the April last week. But we will, because the postpone, so we will end it at the May first week. And I will
Okay,
post on my email to let everybody knows.
great.
So
And I may be, just so you know, I may be in San Jose in April. So
Oh,
if you wanted to do a live event or something, or get together or whatever.
sure, sure, sure. Yeah, send me a schedule when you
Yeah,
when
once I know. Yeah,
yeah. Okay, that'll be great. Yeah. Okay,
cool.
so calling one, calling two, calling three. Okay, we're just ending the class tonight. And thank you, everybody. Thank you, Neil.
You
You're a
bet.
great teacher.
No, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.